My name is Ken Sutherland, and I want to tell you a little about the 39ers, their origin and how it came about. And finally, the story of one of the 39ers for the following 6 years. Now, the Reserve Forces Day Council was formed in 1998 to recognise the value of reserve service to the nation. The inaugural national chairman was the late Sir Roden Cutler VC. The patron-in-chief is Her Excellency Ms Quentin Bryce, Governor-General of the Commonwealth of Australia. And the New South Wales patron is Her Excellency Professor Mari Bashir, Governor of New South Wales. The National and New South Wales chairman is the Honourable Sir Lawrence Street, and Sir Lawrence was a midshipman during the war and served in HMAS Lithgow. The Reserve Forces Day Council is made up in the main of former members of the Navy, Army and Air Force who give their time voluntarily to run the Reserve Forces Day activities. The inaugural RFDs in 1998 celebrated the 50th anniversary of the reforming of the Citizens Force in July 1948. The parades were held throughout Australia in 12 cities, 7 in New South Wales. The Sydney one saw 8,000 serving and former members marching in George Street. Such was the success of the 1998 parade, they now run annually throughout Australia. At the celebration of 2009, the Council acknowledged 70 years service of the reserves who had joined before September the 3rd, 1939. Their stories, in part, have been told in a book published called The 39ers in 1938, when the Prime Minister Chamberlain returned from his negotiations with Hitler, waving a piece of paper claiming peace in our time. There was general relief, but most felt it was a beginning. In retrospect, that year, 1938-39, was a blessing in disguise for Great Britain and the Dominions, in which to work frantically to build aircraft, ships and weapons and accelerate training forces generally. One example of this is small in the larger context, but significant. Forecasting the need for an anti-submarine school in Australia, the Naval Board, with the cooperation of the Admiralty, established a school in HMAS Rushcutter. This wisely provided a second school to HMS Osprey in England. The building of the AS School in Beach Road was finished in 1938, staffed by instructors from Osprey, commanded by Commander Harvey Newcomb, RN. They immediately started selecting and training the first 66 officers and 168 ratings. By September 1939, most of those officers were ready for appointments as AS control officers in the Royal Navy, plus a commitment to supply 32 qualified detector ratings per month to the RN. I joined the Naval Reserve in 1936 as an ordinary seaman telegraphist. Progressing to a telegraphist, I then studied for a commission as a paymaster, which came about in April 1938. When the war was declared on the 3rd of September 1939, I was mobilised immediately, and shortly after, the Navy called for candidates for the first wartime anti-submarine officers. At its conclusion, I was appointed a Sub-Lieutenant RANVR on loan to the Royal Navy, arriving in UK in October 1940. It is interesting to note that by 1944, 336 officers and 1,300 submarine detector ratings were trained in rush cutter and sent to the Royal Navy. It was estimated in 1943 that about 1 in 4 AS personnel in the RN Battle of the Atlantic were Australians. My first appointment in October 1940 was to HMS Southern Gem, a whale catcher converted to an escort vessel with AS gear and a 4-inch gun. When built, it was designed for conversion to an AS escort. A few months later, I was appointed to HMS Daneman, a Fleetwood trawler designed for conversion, like Southern Gem, to an escort vessel. There were many of these vessels, similar to the Flower-class corvettes, that were workhorses of the Atlantic groups early in the Battle of the Atlantic. Westbound convoys from UK were only escorted halfway across the Atlantic. The Daneman, being a coal burner, would coal in Reykjavik and then join an eastbound convoy back to the United Kingdom. Well, I particularly mentioned Daneman and Southern Gem because they were both commercial vessels. One was a trawler for use, a Fleetwood trawler, common in British waters, used obviously for trawling. And they were single-engined coal burning in the case of Daneman. Most of them were oil burners. They were capable of 15 knots, a very good platform for AS gear. And the Admiralty had the foresight to, overseeing their plans when they were building those trawlers, and I suspect the Admiralty might have helped them financially, to alter the trawler such that they could take the underwater gear, just fit it on because it didn't have to do any alteration to the ship, fit the underwater gear, and for the forecastle to be strong enough for a 4-inch gun mounting. And that's what happened with dozens and dozens of trawlers, which I say were very, very useful number of ships to supplement the escort forces in the early days. Many of these were heavily attacked by U-boats. In one such attack, when many ships were lost over 2 or 3 days, Daneman had picked up 131 survivors, including the crew of a Norwegian ship whose captain insisted that the first thing out of the lifeboat was his #1 uniform on a coat hanger. The very act of rescuing men in a lifeboat is quite hazardous in even a moderate sea, let alone the risk of stopping. I don't know whether non-Navy people wouldn't realise this, but when you stop at sea, you're in severe danger in Atlantic waters, because you would catch a torpedo just the same as any merchant ship. But being stopped, being small and manoeuvrable, you were hard to hit. But if a German saw an escort stopping or a destroyer stopping to pick up survivors, he would make that a #1 target. And we did it so many times. And that would be the conclusion if a Navy fellow had been listening to what I was saying about picking up survivors, he'd know precisely what the risks were. Regrettably, survivors were often not found, during 42, I think it would be, if I remember rightly, the Admiralty adopted a policy of putting a small merchant ship, they'd find a small merchant ship from somewhere, and they would name it the rescue ship. And we used to put it in the rear columns of every convoy. And by that time, when people needed to be rescued, that merchant mariners from their own ships, needed to be rescued, the merchant ship would do it and not the escort. Because if the escort's doing it, they're not out there chasing submarines and forcing them away from the convoy or defending the convoy. So you can see the logic of it. We would put the prisoners in one of the engine rooms that we're not using, and the destroyer shuts down one engine room as a rule on that sort of work, escort work, to conserve oil. And anyway, we didn't need the extra speed that a destroyer is capable of. And we just locked them up in the engine room with a guard, and that was it. Gave them warm clothing, dry clothing, fed them and treated them with respect, yes. And I suspect they were glad to get back to Halifax and a nice, safe prisoner of war camp after what they had been through. I was appointed to HMCS Restigouche in the 4th Canadian Escort Group and transferred once again when HMS Churchill became group leader under Commander McKillop, RN. The group's next task was to escort troop ships to the Mediterranean for the North African landing. My memory was a pleasant summer holiday enjoyed by all in comparison to the North Atlantic.